St. Paul Island and some of the islands in the Bering Sea, they have found fossils of these grazing animals. So they didn't swim out there. They were out in the middle of the land bridge when they died.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. During periods of glaciation, otherwise known as ice ages, our sea levels dropped by as much as 480 feet. The Bering Sea is only about 160 feet deep. Therefore, during these periods of global cooling, what today is the Bering Strait was dry land. Land that supported plant life and animals, and which led to the initial migration of humans from Asia into the Americas 13,000 years ago. Today on the show, we have our second interview with Fairbanks author Dan O'Neill, whose 2004 book, The Last Giant of Beringia, The Mystery of the Bering Land Bridge, discusses not only the land bridge itself, but also the scientists, in particular geologist Dave Hopkins, who worked so hard to synthesize the evidence that has led to our current understanding. Dan O'Neill, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Good to be back.
So to get started, this book, The Last Giant of Beringia, how did this book come about?
Well, let's see. My colleague and mentor in the oral history field, Bill Schneider, who ran the oral history program at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, had kind of been bugging me for years to write a book about Dave Hopkins. And I knew a little bit about Dave Hopkins, but that kind of wasn't enough of a pitch to excite me about the project. But the Park Service approached me about writing a book about one of their new park units, the Bering Land Bridge National Preserve. And of course, Dave would be a really logical core of such a book. Or in other words, you could conceive of a book structure that covered the kind of issues the park wanted covered, but did it with Dave as the vehicle to take you through that. So it'd be somebody a reader could focus on, his life story. And as you went through his life story, you would incidentally get all the details of what might be called environmental history of the Bering Land Bridge region, eastern anyway.
I want to interrupt really quick and just say that when I read the book, I envisioned that you had planned on writing a book about the Bering Land Bridge and that you had stumbled upon Dave Hopkins while writing that book, and then had decided to use Dave as a centerpiece for the book. But it's actually, I had it opposite. And you really were setting out to write a book about Dave that happened to be about the Bering Land Bridge. Is that correct?
It's almost chicken and egg-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Bill had been bugging me to do a, quote, biography of Dave Hopkins, and I couldn't really see doing that. It's just, I want to write enduring work about, so far in my writing, Alaska topics for a literate but wide audience. And I don't think a strict biography of a scientific giant who worked in Alaska really quite reaches out as far as I would like.
The beginning of the book does really lay out his early life, his family. And I think for our listeners who may have no idea who he is, can you sketch out Dave Hopkins and why he's so important?
Sure. He was born in New Hampshire and in a rural area, and very, very precocious, and always the youngest one in his classes and getting moved ahead, and eventually went to Harvard to work on a PhD. The war interrupted, and he worked in the Aleutians. It was stationed in the Aleutians, where he got interested in the botany of the Aleutians, and then.
And what year was that around? That, I mean, obviously it was World War II.
Yeah.
So it was pretty early. I mean, just giving people a reference, it was the 1940.
Early 40s, yeah. And so then after the war, he went back to Harvard, finished his PhD, and signed on with the U.S. Geological Survey, and kept doing more and more Alaska field work, and was just enthralled with Alaska and the geological opportunities there. It was fairly unknown and unsurveyed, a lot of it. And so he contrived to get himself assigned to the Alaska branch, so-called, of the USGS, which was based in Menlo Park. And then he went down there, moved there, and continued to have whatever 50 odd years of Alaska research, and then ultimately organizes a couple of classic books which define the science of the Bering Land Bridge to that point. These came out in the first one was in the late 60s, and they're kind of considered the Old Testament and the New Testament of Beringian science. And more than anyone else, he pulled together all the science from various disciplines to talk about whether there was a land bridge, if it existed, when it existed, what it looked like in terms of its biogeography, and to some extent the role it played in the peopling of the Americas. So he was Mr. Bering Land Bridge in the modern era. The idea is hundreds of years old, but more than anyone else, Dave pulled all the strands together and gave us a picture of the Bering Land Bridge.
And what is the Bering Land Bridge?
Well, the name given it by the Russians after Vitus Bering is Beringia, and that includes eastern Siberia and the western part of northwest North America, so all of Alaska and some of the Arctic Canada and Yukon. And at different times in the geologic past, we had cold periods where the glaciers grew. So what was happening there phenomenologically was that clouds would form over the ocean, transport ocean water over the land, fall as snow, freeze on mountain systems, and build up as glaciers, all of that reducing the height of the sea. So as these cold periods progressed, more and more water was leaving the oceans and staying in the form of ice on land. So that had to lower the sea level. And it turns out that the broad plain between Siberia and Alaska is shallow. But the surface, the bottom of the sea there, the Bering Sea, is not very deep.
Like 180 feet or something like that?
Yeah, and they could show that sea level had fallen well more than that. So that had to cause this land to emerge from the sea. And so for then thousands of years, there was a broad land bridge, 1,000 miles north to south, connecting Siberia and Alaska.
I'm just going to interject really fast that what I thought was so interesting and counterintuitive is that during these ice ages, these periods of glaciation, that we had ice sheets that really covered a lot of the lower 48, but not Alaska. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very counterintuitive, that this land bridge and Alaska and part of Yukon and Siberia was actually not covered in ice, while so much of the rest of the world was.
That's right. The glaciers that were enormous in North America, covering pretty much all of Canada and pushing all the way down to, I forget, Kentucky or almost that latitude, Nevertheless, there was an area of interior in northern Alaska that was glacier-free. And that was primarily because of the Alaska Range keeping the sea's moisture to the coast where it was glaciated, but not letting enough moisture in to glaciate interior Alaska. So that area and part of Yukon Territory similarly. And that became a great refugium for plants and animals during the Ice Age to continue to thrive. And that land bridge, too, was also inland and dry. And so there was a broad connection between Eastern Asia and Western North America, Northwestern North America, where animals went back and forth between the old and the new world, and plants, and ultimately people.
One thing that stood out for me was the research they did where they were measuring the Bering Sea floor, looking for riverbeds, and having that realization that the Yukon River flowed, across towards Siberia, that the Yukon River was longer, during that period because it didn't flow into the sea. It kept going. And I think I just had, a moment of realizing how much longer, the Yukon River has been around, and how it's changed and done different things over the millennia. I just found that to be really interesting.
Yeah. So it was longer because it had longer to go to the coast because the Bering Sea had fallen. And the Bering Sea floor is one of the flattest places on Earth. It had just basically been silted in by these big rivers. And so what bathymetry, what topography would be below that silt, people, had no idea. And Hopkins came along with a couple other guys and ran transects on a ship that penetrated the silty surface and could find rocky formations below. And so he was able to map out these canyons. And at first, the only thing that was known was when a ship went across, there would be a depression, but nobody really knew if it might be a hole or a linear void. And so he showed that they were essentially finding the mouths of river canyons that extended under the silt on back up toward the mainland. And they postulated that these were the ancient river channels of the Yukon and Kuskokwim and Kobuk and so on. And they corresponded pretty well with these canyons and their orientation. So that was just another way to prove, too, that the Bering Land Bridge existed, because that had to be dry land for those kind of watercourse-like canyons to have been carved.
Mm. I know that you, when I sent you my questions, you had some concerns that focusing on some of the other characters might give them undue emphasis, but I did wonder if we could talk a little bit about Louis Giddings, and especially his solo jaunt up the, when he did some risky research in the early 40s in terms that actually moved this science along. And I thought some of his stories that you told in the book were particularly memorable. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about Giddings and his contributions and how his risks paid off.
Yeah, it was kind of an anomalous chapter, as was the one on Hultain, Eric Hultain, the great botanist who worked in Siberia and Alaska, and older than Hopkins and Giddings. But
well, I'll just say really fast about the Swedish botanist Hultain. He really proved that, because, correct me if I'm wrong, by looking at the plants in Alaska and Yukon and their similarity with the plants in Siberia, that sort of began the scientific validity of the Bering Land Bridge as being one piece.
Right. I think he could show the connection between species on either side of the Bering Land Bridge that would be less likely to happen unless the lands were connected by dry ground. But anyway, the thing was that my goal, I was saying before, was to tell the story of the Bering Land Bridge by following one scientist's life, Dave Hopkins. But when I encountered Hultane and Giddings, they were just such interesting and important characters and related. They were the shoulders on which Hopkins stood. And so I just couldn't help myself but do a really pretty good coverage of those guys. So I did a chapter on each. But I think structurally, it's a skeletal bump that doesn't make anatomic sense, but I couldn't resist. And Giddings particularly was a really interesting character for me, because when he was a young man in Alaska, he really didn't know for sure if he wanted to be a scientist and go on that direction, or just be a gold miner, a prospector out in the country on his own. So that I really think that's a characteristic Alaskan young man trait. And he ended up studying dendrochronology, which is tree ring science, at Arizona, where there was the leading tree ring science expert, and working in the gold mines of Alaska in the summer. But also he'd get jobs with the anthropologists on campus, and he ended up being involved in a big discovery near Point Hope, the Putak site. And so little by little, he decides, well, hell, I'll give this archaeology business a whirl. And so he decides that he's going to fly out to Karikuk, I think is where he started, and from the university there in Fairbanks, and then walk up the Karikuk a certain distance, and then hang a left, set his compass west and walk west. And this was a territory that had not been mapped. The USGS maps were simply white in that region.
And just to give some frame of reference, he was talking about like walking 90 miles. This was not like he was going on a little, a little 5 mile, hike. He was going to walk 90 miles, or it was a big one.
Yeah. And nobody had done it and never come back. And the University of Alaska president, who was very familiar with Alaska, strongly discouraged him from doing it, that it was too dangerous. And then when he got to Karikuk, the missionaries there were frantic about this, because they said only one person had ever tried that, and they were never heard of again. And Giddings was completely undaunted, and he had a bedroll and a 22 and some fish hooks and not a lot else, and took off upriver, hung a left, going west. And, he's got to hit the Kobuk River somewhere. And if he does, his idea is just to somehow build a raft and float out to civilization down the Kobuk. And he needs to hit a lake in the middle, and that'll confirm he's going the right way, and maybe he can catch some fish. And meanwhile, he's kind of shooting ground squirrels and subsisting off that and some rice. And so a real classic Alaskan adventure. Anyway, he does hit the Kobuk.
And this is like the late 1930s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sometime in the 30s there, yeah, because not even mapped. So he is absolutely blind out there. But he does hit the lake, and he catches fish and shoots ground squirrels, and he makes the Kobuk. And then he starts, finding logs, because he didn't even bring an axe or a hatchet. And his idea was to lash them together with spruce roots, but he had his tree coring tool with him, and he realized that if he took cores of trees, he would essentially could bore a hole through them, and then he could whittle pegs and pin these logs together with pegs he'd pound in with a rock. So he's going back to very Stone Age technology, and he does make this raft, and he goes down the Kobuk and stops here and there at potential sites of habitation of ancient people, and does a little digging in the little depressions, house pits that he finds in likely spots. He found a number of sites which lay on that, completely unsupported trip. Nobody funded anything, and he had almost no equipment. He found one of the most significant archaeological sites in the entire circumpolar Arctic, but that he would discover its importance much later, many years later. But it remained in his mind, this kind of anomalous presentation of artifacts in one house pit at Onion Portage on the Kobuk. And later, when he was trying to figure out some chronology, he went back there. And that turned out to be one of the great discoveries ever. And of course, it was made by a lowly grad student with no budget.
When he found the artifacts, he recognized that they were similar to some found in the Gobi Desert that were about 10,000 years old. And so he thought that he was finding things from 10,000 years ago. It turns out that later dating moved them to around 5,000 years. But so he was recognizing the same sort of tools from Asia in that site.
Yeah. So that was quite an interesting little scientific discovery that he made, and he continued to make them. And it was a tragedy. He died young because he was.
Yeah. And you told that story, and that was it was a moving story about his death. Part of, and it comes up later in the book a little bit, is that some of these camps are underwater. Well, so much of the potential telling of the story, especially moving much further south down towards the lower 48 and down to South America, is that a lot of that might be underwater, I'm assuming.
Yes, because the seas come up since Bering Land Bridge time.
I guess, and you make that very early in the book. I think that we're talking about the seas at their when they were receded the most was about 480 feet. It's an enormous amount of water that was held at the height of the Ice Age.
Right. Yeah. The whole coastline of the continent changed, but changed least where it was steepest, obviously, but where it was shallow changed the most, like in Bering Land Bridge. And so Hopkins was running around trying to figure out old sea levels and date the sea level, because if he could do that, he would be essentially dating when the land bridge existed, must have existed, and not. And so some of these house pits were underwater, and people obviously didn't build houses where they would be standing in a foot of water. So either the sea level had come up or the land had subsided, and both things happened in different places. But if you could date a particular house in two widely separated regions and they were both submerged, then you have a pretty good idea that it was sea level rise that did it. And another example of how he was trying to get at proving the land bridge existed and dating when was what he called a kind of reflexive equation, that the land bridge behaves kind of like a drawbridge, in that when the bridge connected the roadway and the Bering Land Bridge existed, then traffic went through in both directions. But then when it turned into accommodate water traffic, then you had the migration of marine species, plants and animals, in both directions. So that if you could date a particular marine organism from the Pacific existing over either in Bering Sea or the Arctic Ocean or all the way over to the Atlantic in a certain stretch, then you could show that the waterway was there, Bering Strait was there. But if you could date land fossils, bones primarily, of animals that were on both sides of Bering Strait at the same time, evolving similarly, not separated, then you could show the existence of the land bridge that way. And as he looked into the literature of the marine people versus the bone people, the paleontologist people, the molluscan people, well, he found that they didn't agree at all, and that in fact they never talked to each other. And he brought a couple of them together, which developed into a loud and rancorous argument, he said. And he could hardly get them to sit down together and try to accommodate one another's dating methodologies and thinking. And so that was one thing that led to his first book, was to try to bring together scientists from many disciplines who were kind of compartmentalized and working within their own brotherhood and not trying very hard to reconcile one discipline with the other.
Right. So two things. One is, I think you made the point that some of these scientists who weren't talking to each other actually were working in this, some of them working at the same universities and had offices that were in the same hallway, and they weren't even talking to each other. And so it wasn't an issue of bringing people from, across the world together, but sometimes just bringing people from the same hallway together. However, he did bring people from other countries together, because one of the big things that he did in that book was include Russian scientists, which, of course, this is 1970. It was the Cold War. There was not cooperation happening between the Soviet Union and America. So that was a big step, an important step, I would guess, that he included Russian scientists in the first book.
Absolutely. He was building his own bridge across Bering Strait, because the Russian scientists were working completely separate from the scientists in the West and had very little ability to exchange ideas. But Hopkins had that as a focus throughout his whole research career, was to bring the Russians in. And so he invited 5 or 6 of them, I think, to submit papers. And he said when he got them, he had them submit them in Russian and in English, but the translator at their institute was not a very good translator, and the English versions were hopeless. So Dave had a Russian-speaking colleague read the paper to him in Russian while Dave sat at a typewriter and basically translated the science. And he said he was mortified to mess so heavily with somebody else's work, but he did it. And when he went to Russia the next time, he was really worried about his reception, but they were delighted because he'd done a really pretty good job, and he had given their work exposure in the West, which they hadn't had before. And every time he went, for example, to Russia, he brought books for his own reading that would otherwise be banned in Russia, with the purpose of leaving them behind. Some of the good Western literature that the Russian people weren't allowed to read. And so he made enduring friends. And maybe one of his best friends of his life was a Russian scientist called Andrei Scher.
This is kind of going out of chronological order for the book, but I think he almost died in Russia. And I think telling a little bit of the story of the very end of his life and, having a lot of health problems, but continuing to try to do these crazy adventures in the name of science, but doing one on the Siberian side, I think was a particularly, maybe, in retrospect, not the best idea.
Yeah, well, he figured he'd had a full life. He'd done what he wanted to do. And if he was going to die, dying out doing field work would be the perfect way to go. He didn't end up dying that way, but he came close. So he was out in Siberia with a couple of his grad students and some of the Russian scientists doing work in tough conditions. They were hell and gone, and they had some boat support on a remote coastline. But he had a lot of things wrong with him, heart trouble, and I think he had
kidney problems. He was on dialysis.
Later dialysis, but at that point, I think kidney colostomy bag.
Oh yeah, a urostomy. It was a urostomy. Oh, so he was already having, he was already having some serious issues.
And there was a funny part in the book where he's out somewhere and he breaks his last bag, So I think he plumbed in a garbage bag or something, but he contacted Gene Schaaf in Anchorage, who was a Park Service gal who incidentally got me a bunch of funding to do this book. But she was away from home too, and she got her husband to rushed down to a pharmacy to try to get the bags, and the pharmacist was in there, but it was closed. And so the husband was banging on the door, and the pharmacist wouldn't open up. And he was explaining how desperately he needed these things for this old guy out in that bush. And the pharmacist noted that he had a lot of raffle tickets he had to sell for his kid's school thing. And the guy said, "I would very much like to buy several of those tickets." So they opened up the door, the tickets were sold, the bag was purchased and flown out to Dave, wherever the hell he was. But that one in Siberia, he became gravely ill, and his two grad students, tried to get him rushed off. But they
couldn't fly in. There was bad weather.
Yeah.
They were off the road system.
And so they had to lighter him out to a boat. And the thing was it looked like he would be killed in the transport via boat. He was getting thrown all over the pilot house of this little boat. And then I think finally didn't a big Russian ship come or something?
Mm-hmm. A big Russian ship came, but there was a lot of radioing out that they needed help, that they had a famous American scientist who had to be flown out. And it was... And then he ended up back in Fairbanks, eventually had triple bypass surgery because he'd had a heart attack on that trip. I want to talk about the part that most people are most interested in, which is the human migration. There was multiple periods of the land bridge being present over the last 20 million years. There were 3 mammalian surges that you talked about. I will do the disclaimer that this book is from 20 years ago. There's been a lot of new science. However, I will say, as a reader, it's pretty exciting when we get to the end. Your chapters on the human migration come towards the end. It's great reading. And I think just because I as a lay person who doesn't study this stuff, thought it was so interesting that, you had the people. It's kind of like the difference between the people who were studying the sea and the land bones and them not agreeing, is that you had the people studying the teeth of the ancient peoples, the people studying the languages, and the people studying the archaeologic records. So you had these 3 different groups of people or scientists who were kind of trying to figure out which people came first, how the people were related, and how they had moved into the Americas. And again, you had a situation where the different groups of scientists did not agree. It was really interesting. So I don't know how comfortable you are talking about any of that.
Well, it has developed a lot, and I think in general people are starting to agree that the migration of people into the New World occurred at an earlier date than was generally accepted when I wrote the book, and so it seems that that's being pushed back, and a little more emphasis is placed on coastwise migration, which I did cover. One of Hopkins' students, Jim Dixon, was a leader in that branch of thought, that it wasn't necessarily all landward. They certainly came across the Beringian shore. It certainly had a northern filter to the migration into the New World, and the Bering Land Bridge is key to that in any event. But they may have come much more rapidly and gone much farther than previously thought by using boats along the coast, because even where it was very glaciated, there likely would have been places to land because the ocean is a big heat sink. So it might have been dry, not iced at a lot of the shoreline places. But so when I told the story, it was kind of like you say. I mean, Dave was a geologist, and he was interested in the existence of the land bridge as a geomorphological reality, and also its paleoecology is what they call it, what it looked like, what plants and animals it supported. But he got a little bit into the record of people migration, particularly with his association with Giddings, who was an archaeologist. But like you say, as time went by, then people who study teeth we're finding out, this was a really great way to group people and date them, because teeth could be dated. Teeth were tougher than bones. They lasted longer. And there were examples of certain kinds of dentition that were associated with certain groups of people that had certain genetic traits. And then actually another group that you could mention is geneticists, so archaeologists, people with teeth, linguists, but also geneticists. And that's probably evolved a whole lot since I wrote the book too. But I went to all these experts. Pretty much everybody was happy to talk to me because they love Dave so much. And normally they are a little reticent about talking to, quote, journalists. But, I didn't have any particular axe to grind. I just wanted, Dave was kind of, whatever Dave thought was the direction I went in, because I was linking everything to his work. But in the end, generally speaking, the teeth people and the linguists, with some support, maybe not dispository, but some support from the geneticists, figure there were 3 pulses of human migration. And just and this is no longer up to date or anything, but generally speaking, and the truth is nobody agrees on anything, and everybody pokes holes in everybody's theory. And so there is no one answer. And it's the way science works. It evolves. We learn more and we adjust. And that's not a fault of science. That's to its credit. But something like 13,000 years ago, more or less, a pulse that is often called the Amerind came through. And they are judged to be the first because they're the group that made it the farthest south, so to the tip of South America. And their language had hundreds of variants, like going on 1,000 variants of their language, which means it must have had more time to split. Then the next pulse, maybe 10,000 years ago, although people argue about this, was a group sometimes called the Na-Dene, and that included the Athabascans and outliers like Navajo and Apache, who had linguistic similarities with the Athabascan language. And they had more language variation than the Eskimo group. And they were the next most southerly. And then finally, maybe on the order of 4,000 years ago, the Eskimo Aleut group that had very close language affinities with Siberian people, contemporaneously nowadays, and old world languages. And they were, of course, located nearest to Bering Land Bridge. So for a number of reasons, besides it kind of just makes sense, the guys nearest it now might be the last to have displaced the ones before.
That was an epiphany for me as a reader. I thought, oh, wow, I have to really think about it because, when you talk about like the St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and of course, St. Lawrence Island, St. Paul, those islands were high points on the land bridge, and I think for me, I think of those as the original people. And interestingly, those would have been the most recent arrivals,
Yeah. Well,
millennially speaking, but it was it was interesting. It was an interesting way of reframing it for me in my head.
Yeah, well, and part of that I think is current cultural phenomenon that likes to make these things very simple and really simplistic. That first there were the native people, and then there were the white colonizers. But actually, there was waves of indigenous people, and really they weren't indigenous if they came from Asia to North America. So I don't even know what term would properly apply, but they did displace groups that were there before them successively.
Right. And also, again, going back to the sea level being so much lower, there were other land bridges around the world. The United Kingdom was part of Europe. We were one continent. You could conceivably walk from London to New York. And I mean, obviously over a lot of ice. And so, it's not really, and the last thing I want to say, and I was trying to do some research this morning on this, but an important thing to remember as we talk about it a lot with other animals, that they would move, the movement was going in both directions, that there was human migration from the Americas back to Asia, when the land bridge was open. It wasn't just a one-way traffic.
Yeah, that would make sense, that when a group felt the need to expand, they didn't necessarily always go in one direction. I mean, it would be logical to go into the unsettled territory, all right, but who knows, kinship and nostalgia could have sent people going back to, and certainly the animals went both directions and the plants. And that phenomenon too of the chains showing up more as you got farther from the land bridge was first noticed way back when, 400 years ago or something, by a friar, De Costa, wrote about him somewhere in there. And he reasoned that the continents would be near unto one another in the north, because the animals on Old World and New World were more similar in the northern parts of their respective continents than they were in the southern parts of those continents, which would suggest that they intermingled in the north and diverted as they migrated south over time. And that was a really pretty brilliant notion, and was true.
Well, I think that's maybe a less controversial place for us to stop. But, again, going back to the fact that the land bridge was present multiple times over the last 20 million years. And we do have all these fossils of animals that are extinct, and including the mammoth, including the lions, the big cats that we had in the far north. I want to just comment that your book has a lot of photographs and illustrations throughout. And that is, it makes the book a more interesting reading experience. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the decision to include so many photos, illustrations, and including, I'm trying to find them now. There was a section that had some photos of the, page 137. You have the picture of some of the Ice Age mammals.
Yeah. Paintings. Yeah. By a really wonderful painter. It's Canadian, and he let me reproduce those. And we didn't get into, but another time, there's a tremendous debate about whether Beringia looked anything like this at all. In other words, with these herds of mammoth creatures and all these giant predators and so on, because there's a whole theory that the land bridge was too dry and barren to support grasses that you'd need for herds of mammoth, for example, or bison or horses. Right.
Well, you explored that controversy. That was with Paul Colenvo. I don't know how to say it. Colenvo. Where he was and I don't know the word for it, but a pollen scientist.
Yeah.
Who studied pollen. Yeah. And that based on the pollen record, he believed that there was not enough plant life to support large herds of mammals. Yeah. But of course, we have the mastodons, the elephant creatures that require an enormous amount of calories. So it's kind of like, by the very nature of the presence of these fossils, we knew they had enough to eat.
Yeah, well, that's about right. Yeah. And the fellow who was advancing that line of thought was Dale Guthrie of UAF, and in particular, and he and Collinvo had a number of back and forths over this in the literature, but it's incontrovertible that some of the mummies of mastodon and bison and so forth had grasses in their gut, had grasses between their teeth, still preserved. And, the transit time of food in an elephant is maybe half a day, but it's not days. And so They had to have feed nearby. And like you say, too, on St. Paul Island and some of the islands in the Bering Sea, they have found fossils of these grazing animals. So they didn't swim out there. They were out in the middle of the land bridge when they died. And so there's a number of actual tangible evidence, quite apart from the extrapolation that the pollen people are doing. Because these pollens are on the lake bottom, it doesn't necessarily give you a good picture of what the vegetation was right there. Some stuff could have been transported by streams, for example, and piled up and not been a picture of the nearby habitat at all. So anyway, that controversy raged. And when Dave actually helped confirm that the nature of the land bridge in many parts was more on the order of a steppe, a dry grassland, good footing for ungulates, hoofed creatures, and with enough grasses and so forth to support those herds. And then, of course, the predators who followed after them, including man. And the way...
Right. And I'm going to just interject really fast. And about the hoofs in particular, that the type of hoofs of these animals, they could not go through marshes. They had to be on dry land. And so, in other words, these hoofs wouldn't work on much of what Alaska's land is like today. It had to have been a different type of terrain.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been much harder for them to do well with their hoof morphology compared to the split hoofs of caribou and moose, which splay out when they depress on soft ground. And these, the horses had not split hoofs and so on.
Sorry, I know I may have distracted you, but we're getting towards the end of our time, and I want to just do one more thing because it was so good. And that was talking about the Devil Mountain Lakes. I really want to talk about Devil Mountain Lakes, what formed them, and what the significance is, because that was another mind-blowing moment for me.
Right. And that actually flows right out of what we were talking about, because that great product, they called it the productivity paradox, was the land productive enough to support these teeming herds of ungulates? And so that was debate raged for a long, long time. And Dave, when he was out by the Devil Mountain Mars, these were the volcanoes.
And I never heard of a mar. I have to be honest. Full disclosure, I didn't know what a mar was. M-A-A-R.
Yeah, a lot of people don't. And anyway, they're volcanoes, except they don't have a conic mountainous structure. They come right up out of flat ground. And usually they result in a lake. And there were these two twin lakes up, where was it? Espenberg area. And
Espenberg is like Northwest Alaska. Yeah. A lot of this book is Northwest Alaska. Yeah, for those of us who are not from Northwest Alaska, I just call it all Kotzebue, but that's not correct.
No, and it's the northern tip of Seward Peninsula, Cape Espenberg. And up there are a number of lakes, including the Devil Mountain Lakes, which are Mars. And so they shot out all this ejecta, bullet-sized rocks, and also a lot of ash, which once deposited is called tephra. And what happened was Dave was noticing in the exposures, in other words, where the banks of lakes eroded away, so it had a nice little, like an archaeologist's excavation, a wall that you could look at strata. He found a string of tephra that ran all over in different parts of that region. So he speculated that it was the Devil Mountain explosion and that it had covered a wide area and that it had occurred in Wisconsin time. It had occurred basically at the height of the cold period of the last glaciation. So that it meant when the land bridge was at its broadest, this tephra was laid down. Therefore, what was under that tephra was what was growing at the time of the land bridge.
Right. And so that layer of ash is like a date marker.
Yes.
And everything underneath that ash was at least 4,000 years old, something like that. Well, and everything.
The stuff right under it was what was there when it exploded.
Right.
So that's dating. And so what happened was it laid down a thick layer of ash in places. And you know how this phenomenon works. The permafrost comes up into that newly elevated soil. So now the permafrost came up and froze in place a buried surface of the Bering Land Bridge when the land bridge was at its broadest. So by excavating like an archaeologist does rather than a geologist and taking it down in layers to come to that buried surface, they found plants, all frozen, seeds, catkins, capsules. They found dung. They found the trails of bowls, some bones of animals. And so now they knew what plants were there in this disputed time that the palynologists are inferring based on pollen and the bone guys are arguing based on bones. Well, now Dave could dig up that surface itself and answer the question. And of course, it was relatively regional. This was a subcontinental landmass. It wouldn't have had the exact same vegetation across its 1,000 miles, but it was really excellent evidence, proof that grasses and the kind of forby things, little leafy planty things that animals eat, were there in sufficient quantities to support these aggregations of animals. So that kind of, in my mind, went a long way toward answering the question. And again, it was old Dave at the root of it.
Yeah, and you did a good job of explaining how something being frozen in permafrost in sort of like a marsh-like condition was a better way of freezing things. And they had the example of the woolly mammoth discovered in Siberia. And you had a very good detail that as that woolly mammoth was thawing, that wolves and dogs were eating it. So they were like, the meat was so well preserved that wolves and dogs felt that this was a good food source that had been frozen thousands of years earlier.
Yeah, there's been people who have eaten frozen mammoth meat. And the guys who dug that one up thought about it, but they chickened out and gave it to their dog, some of the well-preserved in the ground meat. And the dogs were fine.
That would be some expensive meat, a very, very rare and expensive meat.
Talk about aging meat.
Well, Dan O'Neill, thank you so much. This was a really great conversation. I'm very grateful for the book. Oh my God. What was your last book that we talked about?
Land Gone. I had to think too. A Land Gone Lonesome.
Land Gone Lonesome. Very different, but really, really mind-opening and helpful, and I'm so appreciative. And I'm really looking forward to next month when we will talk about Firecracker Boys, which you mentioned today, which played a small role in getting this book rolling. But as long as we're still on, I'm still up for it if you are.
Sure, you bet. It's fun.
Okay, well, thanks again. Have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you in a few weeks.
Okay, Andrew. See you later.
Big thanks to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable. Please check out his website, anchoragelife.net, and his YouTube channel, also called Anchorage Life. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. Next week, University of Alaska Anchorage economist Kevin Berry discussing the state of the economy in Anchorage and how we can make it better. Please tune in.